Captain Traoré passes by, flanked by elite soldiers, while American mining executives in suits grovel in embarrassment inside a sparkling gold tunnel. Cameras flash. The entire globe observes. The stillness is broken by conversation. We own this gold. Today is the last day of every ounce you stole and every life you cost. The long-delayed justice is electrifying the air, and the balance is changing for the first time in decades. This is just the beginning of what you are about to witness. Come along for the intense, emotionally charged, and high-stakes adventure that will have you on edge right up until the very end. It was more than just a show. History was being written in real time. The earth-carved, greed-polished gold tunnel now served as a platform for the truth. Traoré took careful action at every turn. Like a defiant drumbeat, each echo reverberates off the walls. The CEOs averted their eyes from him, their hitherto assured stances shattered by the scrutiny of the country. With their chants rumbling like distant thunder, thousands of people gathered outside, squeezed together behind barricades. The setting had been quite different just hours before. Elite units positioned themselves around the tightly guarded mining compound on the outskirts of the Sahel area of Burkina Faso under the cover of darkness. Through illicit tunnels that extended for miles beneath the desert, intelligence had verified that the Americans, working through a network of shell businesses, had been siphoning off gold. The very wealth they had taken was used to line some of those tunnels, such as the one Traoré was now walking through, heart racing. Camera in hand was Awa Diarra, the young investigative journalist who had risked her life to get the damaging documents. She was aware that this was her chance, the evidence she had been seeking for years. She said to herself, "They told me it was dangerous to dig too deep. However, I had to." The raid had been accurate and quick. In coordinated waves, special soldiers with masks overran the compound, blocking escape routes and disrupting communications. The Americans were marched toward the golden proof of their crimes, pulled from their opulent rooms, and robbed of their phones in a matter of minutes. Nobody was able to halt what was about to happen. Despite the cries and pleas of others, the convoy was leading a line of armored vehicles, approaching the capital around daybreak. Traoré had demanded a path that went through the very communities that the mining operations had destroyed. Along the journey, seniors raised their fists in silent solidarity. Moms held up pictures of children who had been killed by farmers, who had poisoned their water, and elders lifted empty baskets. Miriam, an elderly woman, stood in the center of the road until the convoy came to a stop. As she spoke, Traoré went outside, took off his beret, and bowed his head. The choice to hold the public reckoning inside the gold tunnel was both strategic and symbolic. "Captain, they took our land, our water, our sons. Don't let them take our dignity." He looked directly into her eyes and answered, "Never." There was more to this than punishment. It was about taking back the narrative. The unwavering light of accountability now shone through the same tunnel where gold had been, carried under cover of darkness, instead of greed. The walls were lined with soldiers, their rifles ready but down. Cameras from around the world were set up to transmit once per second. There was a sudden hush that seemed to cut through the air as soon as Traoré walked into the room. His boots left damp marks on the polished floor as he headed straight to the executives. Traoré paused in front of the first man, a towering, broad-shouldered man who used to smirk while negotiating million-dollar agreements, and leaned forward just enough for his voice to be picked up by the microphones. "You assumed nobody would. Notice you assumed Africa wouldn't say anything. You discovered today that we are not silent, we are not blind." The man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Traoré straightened, turned to the crowd beyond the barricade, and raised his voice. "This gold belongs to the people, and the people will decide your fate." The roar that followed shook the tunnel itself. Awa Diarra caught every frame. The way the light caught the gold, the way dust swirled in the air, the way Traoré's face held no triumph, only resolve. This was not a victory parade. This was a reckoning. The chants outside grew louder. Justice, justice, justice. And in that moment, it was clear this was not an isolated act. It was the spark of something bigger. A call that would echo far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. As the day wore on, more witnesses arrived. Miners with scarred hands, mothers with tear-streaked faces, elders carrying faded maps of lands now stripped bare. One by one they stepped forward to tell their stories, and with each testimony, the weight on the kneeling men's shoulders seemed to grow heavier. Yet in the distance there were whispers of resistance. In embassies and boardrooms far away, powerful figures were already plotting countermoves. The gold tunnel might be a symbol of justice today, but the battle for it and for the soul of the nation was only beginning. And as the last rays of sunlight pierced the tunnel entrance, Traoré knew the next steps would test not just his resolve, but the courage of an entire people. The night was so still, it felt as if the desert itself was holding its breath. In the darkness beyond the city lights, the mining compound loomed like a shadowy fortress. High walls topped with razor wire, watchtowers spaced at precise intervals, and floodlights sweeping across the yard every 30 seconds. Inside, American mining executives slept in air-conditioned rooms, unaware that their quiet empire was about to crumble. Captain Traoré crouched low in the sand dunes with his elite intelligence unit. They had been tracking the operation for months, piecing together reports from whistleblowers, satellite images, and smuggled documents. Tonight, it would all come together. His voice was barely above a whisper as he gave the final order. Move like a tide breaking against stone. The unit advanced. Silent feet pressed into the sand, avoiding the gravel paths that could betray them. The first team scaled the western wall, cutting the power to the outer security grid in seconds. The compound's lights flickered, then died, plunging the area into shadows broken only by the faint glow of a distant moon. At the southern entrance, another team disabled the cameras with precision shots, each lens cracking like a faint whisper in the dark. Inside the compound, guards were quick to notice something was wrong. A pair of armed men rounded a corner, flashlights cutting through the dark. They didn't get far. Two shadows dropped from above, weapons trained, forcing them to the ground. No shots fired, no alarms raised. Traoré moved through the compound like he had walked it 100 times before. His memory of the satellite maps was flawless. He led his team toward the administrative block, the heart of the operation. This was where the contracts, forged shipping logs, and bank transfers would be stored. Breaking down the heavy wooden door took one swift strike from a breaching tool. The room inside smelled of paper and stale coffee. Filing cabinets lined the walls, but it was the steel safe in the corner that drew his attention. The safe was cracked open, not because someone had been careless, but because the Americans had grown arrogant. Inside, manila folders bulged with printed wire transfers, export licenses bearing forged signatures, and photographs of gold shipments hidden beneath crates of agricultural goods. One folder held maps of underground tunnels hundreds of meters long, connecting the mine to secret exit points far from the compound, each one marked with dates and shipment weights. Billions in gold stolen. Traoré's jaw tightened as he scanned the pages. This is it, he said quietly. The proof. Behind him, Daira's camera clicked, capturing every page, every damning detail. She wasn't supposed to be there. Journalists were rarely allowed in military operations, but Traoré had insisted. The people must see what was hidden from them, he had told her. The deeper they went, the more evidence they uncovered. Laptops still logged into encrypted accounts, invoices from European refineries, emails boasting of how no African authority will dare touch us. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of the empire these men had built on lies and stolen. The operation wasn't without tension. As Traoré's men secured the records, a gunshot cracked the night from the far side of the compound. The sound shattered the quiet like glass. His radio came alive. Contact Northgate. In an instant the air was alive with movement. He sprinted toward the sound, his team close behind. At the North Gate, a handful of American-hired security contractors had formed a defensive line, their rifles raised. One of them barked into a radio in a language thick with panic. Get them out now. A black SUV roared to life, headlights slicing through the dark, its tires spinning in the sand, desperate to escape. Drop your weapons. Traoré's voice cut through the chaos, firm and unyielding. The contractors hesitated. In that moment, a flashbang grenade exploded near the SUV, the burst of light and sound forcing them to the ground. The vehicle's doors flew open, and out stumbled two of the key executives. Men whose names had appeared on every damning document in the safe. Their faces were pale, their expensive suits rumpled from sleep. One tried to speak, but Traoré's soldiers closed in, binding their wrists. More executives were dragged from their rooms, some protesting, others trembling in silence. The air was thick with dust, adrenaline, and the unspoken knowledge that the power dynamic had shifted forever. Traoré stood before them, his presence as steady as the ground beneath their knees. You have stolen from my people, he said, his voice carrying over the sound of soldiers securing the area. You have poisoned our rivers, emptied our land, and thought we would remain silent. But tonight, the silence ends. One of the executives tried to step forward, his voice dripping with defiance. You can't touch us. We have protections. Traoré's eyes hardened. Not here, not anymore. His words left no space for negotiation. He turned to his men. Take them alive. The people will judge. With that, the convoy began to form. Evidence was loaded into secure vehicles. The executives placed under heavy guard. The compound that had once been a fortress of greed now lay in ruins, doors broken, files seized, its owners in chains. As the last soldier stepped into position, Traoré took one final look at the moonlit walls. This night would not be remembered for the raid alone, but for the message it sent across the continent. The age of taking without consequence was over, and as the engines roared to life, the desert wind carried the sound toward the horizon, as if whispering to distant ears that justice was on the move. Daira sat alone in the dim glow of her apartment. Paper spread across her small wooden table like a battlefield map. The city outside was silent, save for the occasional hum of a passing motorcycle. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was holding. Dozens of contracts, all bearing the signatures of American mining executives and high-ranking officials in Burkina Faso. Some were printed on official government letterhead, others stamped with corporate seals, but all shared one trait: corruption, woven into every clause. She had retrieved them only hours earlier, slipping them into her bag as Traoré's soldiers secured the compound. Now, under the flickering light of a single desk lamp, she read them one by one. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear: preferential extraction rights in exchange for expedited permits, adjustments to environmental compliance fees, and most damning of all, direct bank transfers from offshore accounts to personal accounts of local officials. The amounts were staggering, enough to build hospitals, schools, and clean water systems for hundreds of thousands. Instead, the money had vanished into private pockets while villages starved. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to keep reading. Every page she turned seemed to whisper the same story: greed, dressed as partnership, theft disguised as trade. The Americans had been careful, hiding behind layers of shell companies and legal jargon, but the paper trail was too long, too detailed to be coincidence. Somewhere between the 10th and 11th document, her phone buzzed. It was a secure line. "AWA, it's Kamal," the voice said. He was her editor at Radio UA Libra, the last independent station willing to air stories the government preferred to bury. "Do you have enough?" She looked at the mountain of evidence before her. "Enough to bury them," she replied. Kamal's voice was steady, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "Then you know what comes next. Midnight broadcast. We'll patch you in live Barawa. Once you do this, there's no turning back." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. She had been a journalist long enough to know the dangerous blacklists, the possibility of vanishing without a trace. But she also knew silence was a form of complicity, and she had sworn long ago never to be complicit. "I'll be ready," she said. By the time the clock struck midnight, the small studio was lit only by the red glow of the on-air sign. Kamal sat behind the control board, his eyes fixed on her as she adjusted the microphone. Her voice was calm, measured, but every word carried the fire in her chest. "Good evening, Burkina Faso," she began. "Tonight, I will not tell you a story, I'll reveal the truth to you." In order for the microphone to detect the sound, evidence that she was holding anything genuine, she shuffled the papers. "We have been advised for years that our route to success lies in international mining alliances, that we would reclaim the gold that was stolen from our land in the form of roads, clinics, and schools. But these documents reveal a different picture," she said, pausing to allow the gravity of the situation to sink in. "A tale of treachery by those who vowed to help us, bribery, and stolen treasure." She started naming names as she read passages. A minister who, in return for a French mansion, authorized illicit mining permits. A corporate attorney who used phony nonprofits to transfer millions of dollars. Each revelation hit like a heavy blow, including an email from an American CEO that said, "No African court will touch us." Within minutes, the phone lines were lighting up. The voices came first, soft and tremulous. A Bobo Dioulasso instructor who hadn't received payment in 6 months. A farmer whose land the mine had engulfed. The widow of a man who perished in a tunnel collapse, ignored by the business. Then the rage-struck callers demanding restitution, trials, and resignations dot around the radio. One man yelled, "We bleed so they can feast no more." Families gathered around radios in living rooms, all around the nation, listening as though the air itself had altered. It was an awakening, and AWA felt it. Her voice was stern as she read one more phrase from a contract. "All disagreements will be resolved in private in the event of a government investigation." They thought they could keep this a secret forever, my fellow compatriots. But it's open to the public tonight. In reality, if not yet in law, the gold they believe to be theirs is once more ours tonight. It was nearly 1 in the morning when Kamal gave her the signal to finish. For her final remarks, she drew closer. "The men who signed these agreements have been apprehended by Ibrahim Traoré. They will soon stand in front of you, and you will have to choose their destiny. The guilty kneeling in shame is not the end of justice, though. When the people stand up and demand what is rightfully theirs, justice is served." The line died, and the only sound in the studio for a while was the hum of the machinery. Kamal blew a deep breath. Softly, "You just changed the game," he remarked. Streets were still dark outside the station, but she could hear it in the distance. First faint, then growing. Chants, voices, and a crowd carrying the echo of her message through the night. Holding her document bag like a weapon, Awa went out into the cool air. She was aware that the days ahead would be perilous. Strong men would attempt to undermine her, intimidate her, and possibly do worse. She was aware that something had changed, though the truth had reached the populace, and the truth spreads like wildfire once it takes root. As the convoy turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt route, the tires kicked up clouds of whitish dust, and the convoy slowed. Traoré stood at the rear of the leading car, looking out over the horizon. Where there had once been greenery, the terrain was now bare. There was a metallic tang in the air that stuck to the back of the throat. They reached the site of a once thriving settlement. All that was left were the ruins of mud brick homes, their roofs falling in and their walls shattered. Sheets of rusty metal were used to seal the well in the middle of the square. Long deemed dangerous was the water below. In the shadow of a skeleton tree, a few survivors waited. As the car came to a stop, they gently stood up, their faces scarred by years of adversity. Miriam was one of them, an elderly woman with a hunched back, but with the piercing light of memory still shining in her eyes. Leaning on a wooden stick, she took a step forward. She stared at Traoré, her white headscarf billowing in the arid breeze. "You came," was all she said. He lowered his head a little and took off his beret. "I had to witness this firsthand." She gestured for him to follow after nodding. They passed fields devoid of vegetation and the ruins of houses. This place had weird sickly gray soil that was cracked like ancient pottery. When they arrived with their machines, it all began. Miriam spoke in a low, steady tone. "They promised a clinic, roads, and jobs. They instructed our young guys to dig and provided us with helmets. We were unaware that they would steal more than just the gold." She paused close to the well and tapped her staff against the shut lid. The water had an odd fragrance one morning. We assumed it was the soil being stirred by the rain. However, children started getting sick within weeks. Sores appeared on their skin, their stomachs grew. We showed them the clinic they had constructed, but there was no medication in the clinic. Only one nurse indicated she was unable to assist us. Her palm tightened its hold on the staff as her eyes darkened. Musa, my grandson, was just 8 years old. Powerful boy. He used to run non-stop from here to the hills and back. He drank from this well one evening. He coughed uncontrollably that night. He was gone by daybreak. The ensuing quiet was oppressive. Even the soldiers in the vicinity stood still, their faces grim. Like a physical load, Traoré felt the weight of her words rest on his shoulders. He had seen the pictures of contaminated rivers and read the papers. But the reality hit home here, where a child had played and perished. He followed Miriam as she walked to the village's outskirts, where a small creek used to run. The water was thick now, and the banks were accumulating yellow froth. She pointed with her staff and remarked, "This is what they left us. We could no longer farm. The goats died first, then people began to leave. Those who stayed, most are buried now." She turned to face him fully. "Captain, they didn't just steal our gold. They killed our home. They killed our children. You must make them answer for that." Traoré's jaw tightened. "They will," he said, his voice low. "I promise you they will." He gestured to his men who began photographing the well, the stream, the abandoned homes. Samples of the soil and water were taken carefully sealed for testing. Awa Diarra, who had accompanied the convoy, was quietly recording Miriam's testimony. Her camera lingered on the woman's weathered face on the cracked earth beneath her feet. The footage would speak louder than any statistical report. As they moved back toward the village square, Miriam stopped beside a row of unmarked graves. "We could not afford headstones," she explained, "so we planted flowers. Now, however, nothing grows here. If you take them to the people's court, tell them about Musa," she said, looking at Traoré with an unblinking gaze. "Even the flowers die. Inform them of each one." He covered his heart with his hand. "We won't forget their names." Villagers started to assemble around them as a result of seeing the soldiers and captain among them. Some had faded pictures of their loved ones with them. Others carried jars of the tainted water, which they displayed as proof. In addition to sadness, there was a growing sense of defiance in the air. Traoré spoke louder for everyone to hear. "To see the reality, I came. Here I've seen it now, and I promise you that those in charge will be held accountable for every life lost, every contaminated drop of water, and every house destroyed. They will bow down in front of the people they have mistreated, as well as the gold they have stolen." A low chant developed from a murmur that swept over the throng. Fairness, fairness. It carried an unbreakable force. But it was not yelled. Miriam approached him again as the convoy was ready to go. "Captain," she muttered, "when you stand before them, remember this place. Remember Musa, and remember that some wounds cannot be healed with money." He looked at her. "I'll keep it in." Mine. The village vanished into the distance as they drove away, a specter of its former existence. But he couldn't shake the picture of Miriam standing next to the shuttered well, her staff rooted firmly in the ground. The battle was about more than stolen gold at that point. The topic was stolen lives, and that increased the urgency of the fight ahead. No one anticipated how cold the gold tunnel would be. Every gold speck caught the glare like embers in the darkness as its walls shimmered in the harsh white light of portable flood lamps. In order to create a silent barrier between the outside world and the reckoning inside, soldiers surrounded the door with their guns slung but ready. The American executives' pricey suits were crumpled and smeared with dust as they knelt in the middle. Every angle was captured by cameras from national television crews, whose lenses reflected the golden walls. However, this was not a courthouse with robed justices or benches made of polished wood. People were already lining up for this hearing, which was for the people. First to enter the tunnel were the villagers, who moved slowly and deliberately. Others carried bits of shattered mine tools or jars of poisoned water, while others clutched pictures of the deceased. The tunnel seemed to be holding its breath as the sound of their footfall was absorbed by its walls. Traoré stood at the far end, his eyes shadowed by his hat, his posture upright. He didn't have to say anything yet. The room was commanded just by his presence. Miriam was the first witness to come forward. Her wooden stick tapped the polished stone floor as she proceeded without hesitation. She halted a few steps away from the closest executive and fixed him with her gaze. Her voice reverberated back at them down the tunnel as she spoke. She stated in a steady but somber voice, "You killed my grandson. You ruined our land, poisoned our water, and left us to bury our children in soil that will never grow again." Miriam's voice remained unwavering as she stepped back, and the next witness, a man in his 40s with the hardened hands of a miner named Yakuba, stepped forward. "And you thought no one would come for you?" The executive avoided her gaze, instead looking at the floor. "This belonged to my brother," he said, holding it up for the cameras. "He died in your tunnels. Your refusal to repair the supports caused the walls to collapse. We used only our hands to dig him out. You didn't even stop the machines." His eyes swept across the executives. "You see gold. We see graves." More witnesses followed. A young mother whose baby had been born sick after she drank from the contaminated river. A teacher who lost half his students to illness and hunger when their parents' jobs vanished. Each story was a blow not just to the men kneeling on the floor, but to anyone who thought the theft of gold was merely an economic crime. This was blood gold taken at the cost of human lives. Awa Diarra moved through the crowd quietly, her camera capturing every word, every tear, every tightened jaw. The gold walls turned every voice into a haunting chorus, the echoes wrapping around the executives until there was nowhere for them to hide. When the last witness finished, the silence was thick. Traoré finally stepped forward, his boots clicking against the stone. He stopped directly in front of the kneeling men. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his voice cut through the air like a blade. "You built your wealth on the bones of my people. You believed distance and power would protect you. You believed our silence was weakness. Look around you now." He gestured to the villagers, to the gold walls. "This is where your arrogance brought you. Kneeling in the very place you used to rob us." One of the executives raised his head slightly. His voice, "We were only following contracts." Traoré's expression didn't change. "Contracts, signed with bribes, laws bent with lies, words written in the blood of our children." His gaze swept across the crowd. "Here there is no lawyer to twist the truth, no judge to be bought, only the people you stole from and the gold you thought was yours." The villagers' murmurs swelled. Some yelled prison, others demanded that the gold be melted and given back. The sound subsided as Traoré held up his hand. "Justice will be decided here," he declared. "Not in a foreign court, not in secret meetings, here before the eyes of the nation." He looked at Miriam, with her gaze fixed on the males. He moved forward once more and asked, "What is your judgment?" "They ought to live to witness the reconstruction of what they destroyed without them. Allow them to till their hands are as rough as ours, by working the soil they poisoned. Allow them to witness each brick laid with the stolen gold." Next up was Yakuba. "No escape, no comfort. They will never again leave this earth. And they have to dig the wells they poisoned and reconstruct the schools they closed." A murmur of agreement went across the crowd. Traoré turned to face the men on their knees. He whispered, "You hear them. And since you are no longer an executive here, you will follow their instructions. You are the people's prisoners." The troops advanced, hoisting the men to their feet as he took a step back. Shackles clattered on the ground. The peasants stood in the tunnel, surrounded by the glint of wealth that was once again theirs, as they were escorted away toward a guarded conveyance. Long after the men had left, the reverberations of the hearing would continue to reverberate within the gilded walls. The morning in Washington began with a sense of urgency that jars even the most experienced diplomats. Sharp footsteps and the steady chime of secure phones replaced the State Department's regular hum. Overnight, footage of American CEOs kneeling in a gold flame while Captain Ibrahim Traoré loomed over them like a verdict made flesh was broadcast all over the world. By morning, the pictures were being rerun on all the major news channels. Experts arguing about whether this was a diplomatic blunder or a complete scandal. Tensed faces packed the ambassador's meeting room in the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou. A hurried video conference connected them to the Africa Bureau of the State Department. A voice from Washington said, "We have to make a statement within the hour. Disclaim any connection. Emphasize that this is not U.S. government policy, but rather a private business disagreement." The diplomat massaged his temples. "That will not succeed. Signatures, bank transfers, and even references to diplomatic contacts are all included in the documents that AWA Diarra broadcast. It will appear to be a cover-up if we deny too strongly." A voice from the Office of Economic Affairs interrupted. "Then turn around. We had no knowledge of illegal activity and are deeply concerned. Promise cooperation, but only in ways that protect national interests." A junior political officer said, silently in the corner of the embassy room, scanning through an encrypted cable feed. Marked classified texts from the preceding year filled his screen. It sounds like a confession in the subject line. Mining activities, delicate alliances, contaminated local water, discretionary advice, contract renewal, and seamless travel. The same pattern was recorded by every cable. Embassy employees disclose bribery, labor abuses, and environmental harm, but they advise against taking public action to protect important investment routes. He was frozen in place by one cable in particular. It described an 11-month-old private meal with a top Burkina minister, 2 American executives currently under detention, and embassy officials. They were blunt notes. Concern over public dissatisfaction with mining operations is voiced by the minister. The U.S. will be reassured by the embassy that media narratives would continue to be positive. His face was pallid as he looked up. They knew, sir. They did more than simply know. They helped. There was silence in the room. The ambassador clenched his jaw. With a sharp command, "Keep that screen closed. This is more than just a PR crisis if it is revealed." However, it was too late. A subtle message had already been delivered to a press contact by another person in the room. A small number of top advisors at the White House were being briefed by the head of the Africa Bureau in Washington. The visuals are disastrous. We are positioned as the antagonists in Traoré's public morality drama. Before Congress begins to demand hearings, we must take action. Arms crossed. A national security advisor reclined on his chair. You're not seeing the true danger. It's not only about gold here. Influence is the key. Traoré is presenting himself as the spokesperson for African independence. He is accomplishing this by bringing American companies to trial. Other nations will follow his example if he succeeds. There was an uncomfortable silence in the room. They were all aware of the consequences. Decades of meticulously preserved oversight over African resource transactions would be destroyed if one leader could publicly take American assets and parade executives while surviving the reaction. The embassy issued its first formal statement from Ouagadougou. The circumstances surrounding some American citizens in Burkina Faso are known to the United States. We believe due process will be followed and respect the Burkina government's sovereignty. Panic was building inside the embassy walls. Despite the measured, somewhat bland words, employees were instructed to remove any mention of the mining corporations from any materials that were visible to the public. They enhanced security. People who didn't want their names associated with the crisis that was developing started to travel in unmarked automobiles between the embassy and private homes in the affluent neighborhoods. In the meantime, news networks started to share the cables that had been leaked. An unidentified encrypted file with dozens of pages of embassy communications was sent to Ouagadougou's newsroom. Her editor whistled softly as she opened the first one. They can't talk there. Way out of this, he stated. By dusk, the news was no longer limited to African media. This is complicity in writing. Did U.S. officials turn a blind eye? Was the question posed by a primetime anchor in New York. Commentators in Paris discussed whether the gold scandal would hasten the decline of Western power in the Sahel even. As American corporations poisoned an African town for financial gain, the White House press secretary had to deal with a barrage of reporters in Washington, each one asking more pointed questions than the last. Did American diplomats know about bribery? Were these businesses protected by the State Department? Is the administration going to assist Traoré's inquiry? We are monitoring the situation closely and remain committed to our partnership with the people of Burkina Faso. She followed the script, but as the gaps appeared in the private congressional help, they started preparing subpoenas. The mining corporation's lobbyists hurried to set up talks behind closed doors. Just before midnight, Washington sent a final directive to the embassy in Ouagadougou that included this: no more surprises, no matter what. He peered out the window at the city's far-off radiance. The gold tunnel, the CEOs on their knees, and the guy who had the audacity to reveal the secrets of an empire were somewhere beneath that light. He questioned whether containment was already impossible for the first time in his career. The men of the mining community, who had previously wielded pickaxes in the deep shafts, whispered the start of the march. Women, whose skin cracked after washing gold dust off their hands. For years, they had been kept silent by guards who threatened to fire them if they spoke up, telling them that doing so would cost them what little they had. However, everything changed after seeing the gold tunnel footage. They were out on the streets now, fearless, carrying homemade signs and tattered helmets held aloft like trophies from a different kind of combat. They marched in waves from Bobadou. Their chorus was straightforward: gold for the people, not for thieves. As they pounded their feet in time, the city was filled with a constant thunderclap that became louder with each block. While some wore filthy work boots and others marched barefoot, everyone had the same goal in mind. Teenagers who had never been in a mine but knew what had been taken from them, marched with elderly men with hunched backs, each face etched with the weight of loss and the determination to see justice. Women joined to widows, mothers, and sisters. With her camera, Ouagadougou navigated through the crowd, capturing faces as they turned to face her, their eyes blazing with resolve. One of the men she saw was holding out a faded pay stub with almost any ink showing. He said into her microphone, 3 months' wages for a year of work. The remainder, they informed us, was for taxes. We now know its location. Before the first column reached the capital, news of the march reached Traoré, where another man, his hands still scarred from years of work underground, yelled, "We dug that gold. They built nothing for us, not even a clean well." He had the option to observe from a distance, but he decided to confront them directly. The cry wavered briefly as the marchers rounded a bend and saw him standing at the head of the boulevard, surrounded by soldiers, but without a microphone or platform. He moved forward with the people in front of him. A group of retired miners approached him as the throng separated. The tall, slender man in front of them spoke for them. "We've been quiet for too long, Captain. Instead of being transferred overseas, or hidden in vaults, we want the gold restored to the people. We want schools constructed, rivers cleansed, and the countryside restored." It was the rough edge of hope, not fear, that caused his voice to falter. Looking around, Traoré saw a sea of faces. He observed the calm dignity of people who had gone through more than they should have, the lines of tiredness, and the scars of effort. Without amplifying his voice, he replied, "I have seen what was taken from you. I have visited communities where the water was tainted and children perished. I've held the contracts that sold our land for bribery, and I've been on my knees in front of the country in the gold tunnel with those who did this." A mixture of grief and pride rippled through the crowd. He added, "I swear to you, each and every ounce of stolen gold will be tracked down. Each coin will be transformed into a useful resource for the public. Work in clean water, schools, and healthcare. We won't give it back to the people who stole it. We'll use it to reconstruct." An elderly child with a rusted and dented helmet walked forward. He extended it towards Traoré. "I kept only this from those years," he continued. "Accept it, melt it with the others. Allow it to create something better." With both hands, Traoré nodded once in acceptance. "It will," he stated. The chant recommenced around them, this time with greater volume. The phrase "gold for the people, not for thieves," echoed off buildings and spilled into side streets as it rolled along the avenue. The troops at Traoré's side straightened slightly, not as guards, but as observers of something more significant than a trial or an investigation. Reclamation was what this was. People streamed out of homes and businesses to join the march as it headed into the capital's heart. While some distributed water bottles, others flew flags made from repurposed fabric. At the outside of the crowd, a group of school children accompanied by their teacher strolled while clutching tiny gold-painted cards. AWA remained beside Traoré, her camera recording every shoulder clasp, handshake, and movement of the people, and their leader together. She was aware that these pictures would have the same impact as the footage from the gold tunnel. They would display not only the offense but also the solidarity it had inspired. Every corner of Independence Square was crowded by the time they arrived. Traoré ascended the old government buildings, stairs, and faced them. He answered, "You have marched for justice, and you shall receive justice. But be aware that even after the guilty are convicted, the battle is far from over. When no one can steal from you ever again, it's over. When your hard work creates your own destiny, when your wealth is not a stranger's fortune but rather your children's." Chants and cheers erupted in the square, resonating through the rooftops. The call to prayer from a nearby mosque, followed by the ringing of church bells in the distance, blended together like a blessing over the assembly. The miners' uprising turned into more than just a protest at that instant. Under the scorching sun, it turned into a pledge that the country was prepared to rise. The holding area, with its thick concrete walls designed to keep sound in and inquisitive eyes out, was located deep within a secure military installation. The steel table in the middle was illuminated by a faint yellow circle from a solitary bulb hanging from the ceiling. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat on one side with his hands quietly lying in front of him, in a straight posture. Charles Whitman, one of the top executives apprehended during the gold tunnel raid, was seated on the opposite side. The self-assured, slick-talking person who had once controlled boardrooms was no more. Despite the cool air, a sheen of sweat stuck to his forehead, his tie was thrown away, and his fitted suit was crumpled. Both were silent for a long time. Traoré's eyes were unwavering and steady. With his chain wrists clinking lightly against the metal, Whitman shuffled in his chair. He cleared his throat at last. "I believe we can support one another." Captain carefully practiced. The words lingered in the air. Traoré remained still. Whitman leaned forward a little and nodded. "Your point has been made. The public, spectacle, and the cameras are both highly successful. However, you and I are both aware that keeping us here will cause you issues. Economic issues, diplomatic issues, and issues that could be resolved with a deal." He returned, his voice calming. The salesman's tone, "I have access to private accounts that are totally untraceable and hold over $4 billion offshore. You silently let us go. Those funds and public humiliation are over. You might move them to any location you like. No one would ever know military or infrastructure." He reclined as though he thought the offer would tip the scales in the room. Traoré was silent for a few more seconds, his face unreadable. Then, in a low yet piercing voice, he leaned forward. "$4 billion. Do you believe a river is worth that much? How much would it cost a child's lungs to breathe in your dust? How much for the bloated stomachs caused by the tainted water?" Whitman lost his temper. "This goes beyond charity. This is an opportunity to rebuild. Rebuild the things you destroyed." His tone was cool, but there was a hint of threat about it. "You talk about money as though it might make the graves in Miriam's community disappear." Whitman shifted once more, his fists clenched. You think I can give it to the moms who buried their children and say, here now, you can forget. You're not thinking tactically, Captain. You can win this manner without engaging in combat. No, Traoré, he murmured in a tone as icy as stone. This is how you get out of a battle you've already lost. The chair legs scraped the floor as he slowly stood up. The rivers you tainted cannot be recovered. The land cannot be bought to grow again. Furthermore, the dignity you attempted to deprive my people of cannot be bought. Whitman's confidence crumbled as he gulped hard. What then becomes of us? Traoré's face was inches from the table as he bent over it. You confront the public. Every story is told to you. Every face is visible to you. You will either live with the outcome of their decision or die with it. Two troops entered as the door opened. Traoré straightened and left Whitman in the glaring pool of light without saying another word. Adiara was waiting outside the room, her camera ready but lowered. She said he tried to buy you off. There was no question. They always do, said Traoré. They think that everything land, water, and life has a cost and that the world operates according to their rules. He looked in the direction of the door. They are going to discover that there are some things that money, gold, and accounts can never touch. The sound of voices outside the compound became more and more audible as they proceeded down the corridor. Outside the gates, the miners were still huddled together, chanting and hoisting their helmets. Rumor had it that the CEOs were attempting to make covert agreements. With each rumor, the crowd's rage grew more intense. The probability changed when Traoré stepped out into the sunlight. No bargains, no bargains. The noise spread over the area like a wave. The throng became quiet enough to hear him when he held up a hand. His words carried, they think they can buy their way out. He added, they think our rivers, our fields, our children, are for sale. But we are not for sale. Not now, not ever. The square erupted again, the chant turning into a roar. Whitman could hear it from inside his cell, the sound pressing against the walls like a living force. For the first time since his arrest, he understood that the fight was not between him and one man. It was between him and an entire nation that had decided it could not be bought. The first video clip appeared online just after dawn, uploaded anonymously to multiple platforms at once. Grainy at first, then sharpening it showed a boardroom in Zurich, sleek, sterile, and unmistakably European. Around the table sat executives from one of the continent's largest private banks. Their conversation, caught by a hidden microphone, was chilling in its casualness. The shipments arrive under agricultural manifests, one man said, tapping a folder. We process the transfers through our Luxembourg branch, then route them to holding accounts in the Caymans. Another voice chimed in, smooth and confident. And on the Burkina Faso side, any risk of exposure? A third voice laughed softly. None. Their own officials signed off. The Americans handled the extraction. We just make the gold disappear on paper. The footage jumped to another location, an upscale cafe in Brussels. A woman in a tailored suit leaned across the table to speak to a colleague. The profit margins are absurd. It's cleaner than diamonds, and the public barely notices gold. As long as Traoré keeps busy with politics, our lines stay open. She sipped her coffee as if discussing the weather, not the laundering of a nation's wealth. Within hours, the video had gone viral. News anchors across Europe struggled to contain their shock as they confirmed the identities of those in the footage. These weren't fringe operators, they were senior executives from institutions trusted to safeguard the world's wealth, and they had been moving stolen gold through legitimate financial channels with impunity. In Ouagadougou, the footage landed like a spark on dry grass. The gold tunnel, already a national symbol after the public hearings, took on an even sharper meaning. It wasn't just about the Americans. It wasn't just about one company. It was a window into a global network that had treated Burkina Faso as a private vault to be emptied at will. Adiara replayed the video in her newsroom, her pen tapping against the desk. They weren't just helping, she said to her editor. They were the spine of the operation. Without these banks, the gold couldn't move, the bribes couldn't be paid. This was bigger than anyone thought. International markets reacted instantly. Gold prices swung wildly as investors scrambled to calculate the fallout. European bank stocks plunged, and politicians who had long dismissed Traoré's accusations found themselves cornered by journalists waving transcripts of the leaked conversations. In London, the finance minister was pressed outside Parliament. Will you investigate the banks named in this scandal? A reporter shouted. He offered a tight, non-committal smile. We take these allegations seriously. In Paris, a prominent banker resigned, within hours of the footage airing, his statement dripping with denials. Even as investigators raided his offices, in the gold tunnel itself, Traoré stood with a small group of advisors reviewing the growing pile of evidence. The walls seemed to glow brighter than usual under the floodlights, as if the metal itself were aware of its role in the unfolding drama. This tunnel is more than proof of theft now, one advisor said quietly. It's proof of the system that allowed it, and that system is cracking. Traoré nodded. The world thought they could hide behind distance, that if they moved the gold far enough, washed it through enough hands, no one would see the trail. Now the trail is lit for all to see. He stepped closer to the bound executives who had been brought in for another round of questioning. You told yourselves you were just businessmen, he said. But businessmen don't poison rivers. They don't bury children's futures under contracts and call it development. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. You can't fight all of them, Captain. The banks, the governments there, are too many Traorés. Reply was immediate. You start by fighting one, then the next. And when the world sees you will not stop, others join you. Outside the tunnel, the streets of Ouagadougou filled again. But this time, the signs and chants had changed. Not just the miners. One banner read, "Prosecute the bankers." Another showed a map of Europe with gold bars dripping blood. Crowds gathered around large outdoor screens replaying the leaked footage, their faces a mix of anger and grim satisfaction. Internationally, alliances began to shift. In parts of West Africa, leaders who had stayed silent during the American arrests now saw an opportunity. Publicly condemning the European banks won them quick support at home. Privately, some reached out to Traoré, offering intelligence on other networks in exchange for future cooperation, but in the financial centers of Europe, the reaction was different. Behind closed doors, bank directors met with government officials pushing for damage control. We can't afford to let Burkina Faso dictate the narrative, one banker warned during a meeting in Frankfurt. If they succeed, other nations will follow. We'll lose half our mineral channels in Africa within a decade. The irony was lost on none of them. The more they spoke of control, the more they confirmed what the footage had already revealed. In the days that followed, the gold tunnel became more than a crime scene. It became a pilgrimage site. Students came to take photographs. Activists came to leave messages scrawled on scraps of paper, pleas for clean water, demands for education, and vows to protect what was left of their land. The echo of their voices joined the lingering sound of the people's hearing, turning the tunnel into something living, something that would not be forgotten. In a late-night broadcast, AWA closed her report with a single sentence that seemed to capture the mood of the nation. They thought the tunnel was theirs too empty. Instead, it has become the place where they are exposed. And far beyond Burkina Faso, in the glass towers of Europe, that truth was beginning to cost them. The revelation came not from an intercepted foreign message but from a slip in a local report. Buried in the data logs seized from the mining compound was a folder marked simply monthly forecasts. Inside were detailed production estimates, satellite survey maps, and confidential environmental assessment information that only a handful of top Burkinabe officials should have had access to. Days before the arrest of the American executives, one file included the email had been sent straight to a New York-based, protected business account. It was a government-issued address. The name caught Traoré's attention, the Natural Resources Secretary, Minister Salif Khanat. At press appearances, the man had stood next to him expressing solidarity and shaking his hand. It was a blade-sharp betrayal. Khanat had been feeding the enemy while attending all strategic meetings, knowing when raids would take place, planning out illicit tunnels, and even conducting forensic audits of corporate records. Traoré summoned his chief of intelligence. Now, where is he? Captain, at his house. There are guards on the perimeter, but there's no indication that he is aware of our connection, Traoré said. Like the rest of the nation, he will learn. When the caravan pulled away, the streets of Ouagadougou were already waking up. Just after daybreak, Traoré demanded no quiet detention and no secrecy. This would be a public arrest, in one of the wealthiest areas of the country. The armored vehicle came to a stop outside a vast mansion. The property was encircled by high walls, but they were unable to block out the increasing noise of spectators assembling at the gates. Clearly anticipating a diplomatic exchange rather than a pair of cuffed soldiers, Khanat came out the front door wearing a fitted suit. He started to force a smile. Captain, what does this signify? The smile was not returned by Traoré. The meaning is here, he replied, displaying a printed copy of the email that caused the incrimination. Sensing the change, the crowd beyond the walls whispered. Khanat glanced at the page and then back at Traoré. This is a misunderstanding. Traoré nodded to his men and said, this is treason. The steel sound of the cuffs clicking shut around Khanat's wrists reverberated into the street from the walls. Instantly, phones rang, documenting every second as the erstwhile ally was escorted into the waiting car and down the marble stairs of the villa. The city was abuzz by the time the convoy arrived at Independence Square. Crowds gathered, some yelling in shock, others in rage. The jeers followed, but Khanat kept his head down. You sold us, one man, they shouted. With the imprisoned minister at his side, Traoré climbed onto the flatbed of a truck and said, you fed them our gold at the square. The gold tunnel hearings had already taught the nation that foreign exploitation was not their only enemy. Now they would see the rot within. This man, Traoré's voice rang out, was trusted to protect our resources, our people, our future. Instead, he sold our secrets to those who sought to rob us. He gave them the maps of our land, the weight of our gold, the weakness of our defenses for a price. The crowd erupted, the fury almost physical. Khanat opened his mouth as if to speak, but Traoré silenced him with a glance. You betrayed not just your government, he continued, but every child who will grow up with less because of your event, every farmer with poisoned fields, every family who buries their deceased and questions why it takes so long for justice to be served, they have their response today. Shouts followed Connaught as soldiers dragged him away, and then the doors of a transport van slammed shut. In the front row, Awa Diarra had her camera focused on Traoré's face. She whispered, "You're making enemies in high places." Retorting, he said, "High places are where the rot hides. The mind that is robbing us will only find other thieves if we only target the hands that are taking from us." The Americans who had been arrested returned to the facility and saw the state television broadcast of Connaught's detention. They realized for the first time that Traoré was not the only party to the struggle. Even those in his own inner circle found no refuge during the purge. The arrest was talked about in whispery but supportive tones in villages all around the nation. Elders recalled a time when ministers amassed wealth behind closed doors while the populace went hungry and corruption was untouchable. In the middle of the day, one of those doors had been torn from its hinges. That night, Traoré was standing in the gold tunnel again, tracing the cool, shiny wall with his palm. He whispered to himself that justice must be full, or it is nothing. Outsiders had never been the only enemy in the battle. Every hand, whether native or foreign, was reaching for what was rightfully the people's. And as word spread across the nation about Connaught's arrest, one thing became evident. Betrayal would not have a safe haven. It started at a little country school close to Kaya. A teacher named Adama instructed her students to cut out the shape of gold bars from a stack of yellow construction paper that she brought into the classroom. She instructed the youngsters to write on them what you would build if this gold was ours. The children, the majority of whom were barefoot, crouched over their desks, meticulously forming their dreams in vivid yellow. Some people used shaky letters to write hospital. Others sketched images of libraries or playgrounds. Only 3 words were written by one boy: "Here's a roof." The children carried their paper gold bars aloft as they made their way to the town square the following morning. After witnessing the gesture, other schools participated. Photos circulated on the radio social feed in a matter of days. Youngsters, walking with yellow cards, treasured in dusty outfits. The notion ignited. Children soon started to march toward Ouagadougou from towns and villages all around the nation. With their backpacks tucked under their arms, they held the gold bars in their hands. Some wore yellow paper strips as headbands. Others had bold the words for our schools across their shirts. At first, there was only the soft shuffle of tiny feet on dusty paths. No shouted slogans. Parents followed in quiet, allowing the kids to take the lead. There were thousands of them by the time they arrived at the capital's outskirts. From the air, the line appeared to be a river of yellow, flowing toward the city since it was so long. The police had been told not to get involved. After learning of their approach, Traoré left his meetings to meet them face to face. His men formed a polite cordon around him as he waited at the base of Independence Square. The first youngsters came, paused, and stared up at him, uncertain whether to say anything. The girl who broke the stillness was around 10 years old. Maria too was her name, and she came forward holding a folded cardboard gold bar. She had carefully scripted a hospital for my sister on it. Without saying anything, she held it out to him. In contrast to his black clothing, the gold cardboard seemed dazzling. So Traoré knelt to collect it. Softly, "Tell me about her," he urged. Maria too did not cry, but her eyes moistened. The water had made her ill. According to Mama, she may have survived if there had been a hospital nearby. Traoré stood with the cardboard bar up so everyone could see it, and his jaw tensed. His voice reverberated around the area as he stated, "This is why we fight." One after another, more kids came forward and gave him their paper gold. Some had sketched tidy school plans complete with desks and whiteboards. Others had food, water, books, and single-word scrolling. A 12-year-old boy held up a bar that he had drawn the gold tunnel on. However, he had depicted joyful kids at desks rather than executives on their knees. Within, he said to Traoré, "We don't need more tunnels. Classrooms are necessary." The audience started chanting. The Miners' March's irate slogans were replaced by a straightforward, unwavering demand. Gold for schools, hospital gold. Like a song, their pure high voices pierced the afternoon heat. Reporters scrambled to document the event. Later, the video would show Traoré standing with their yellow paper bars up in the air, surrounded by a sea of kids. He had a determined look on his face, but there was also a more intimate sadness that the youngest of them had to make such demands. Moving among the kids, Awa Diarra captured the unguarded moments with her camera near their faces. A young youngster, making a flag-like motion with his gold bar. When she was unable to grab Traoré's hand, a timid girl slipped hers into his pocket. Traoré turned to face the siblings once more, placing a single huge bar between them that said, "One well for all," painted in bold red. "The gold that was stolen will not be locked away," he stated. "It will not be sold to the same hands that took it. It will build what you are asking for. Schools, hospitals, clean water. You will see it happen in your time, not in some distant future." The children responded not with cheers, but with something quieter, more powerful, a ripple of nods, as if they were making their own pact with him. The march did not disperse right away. Many of the children sat in the square, fanning themselves with their paper gold, sharing snacks their parents had brought. Some drew more bars to give to soldiers, who accepted them awkwardly but with visible pride. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the city bathed in gold light, Traoré stood at the balcony of the old government building overlooking the square. Below him, the children's yellow bars formed a mosaic on the ground, a patchwork of dreams laid out for all to see. It was no longer just a protest. It was a blueprint for the country's future, written by the hands that would live it. In that moment, he understood something that would stay with him. The fight for justice was no longer only about punishing the guilty. It was about earning the faith these children had just placed in him. The foundry floor roared with heat and purpose. Massive crucibles glowed, white-hot molten gold swirling inside like captured sunlight. Sparks leaped into the air, as workers dressed in heavy protective gear moved with precision. This was no ordinary refinery shift. This was history being forged literally. Under armed guard, the gold seized from the illegal tunnels and recovered through the investigation was being melted down. The piles of raw, unmarked bullion, once hidden in offshore shipments, or buried in secret vaults, were now being transformed into something new. Each bar, when cooled, would bear not the stamp of a foreign refinery, but the national seal of Burkina Faso, the crossed stallions and shield, sharp and proud against the gleaming surface. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood on a raised platform wearing a simple dark jacket rather than a military uniform. He had come not to supervise, but to speak. Cameras from national and international networks were positioned to broadcast every moment live. The world had seen the gold tunnel. They had seen the hearings, the arrests, the marches. Now they would see what came next. A foreman approached with the first completed bar, still steaming faintly in the cool air. Its weight was staggering, its surface perfect. Traoré took it in both hands, lifting it for the cameras. The crowd gathered outside the foundry gates. Miners, villagers, students, soldiers held their breath. He looked directly into the lens of the primary camera. This, he said, his voice, deep and steady, is not for vaults. This is for building our future. He set the bar down on a table beside him, where it gleamed under the lights. For too long, our gold has left this land without leaving anything behind. It has paved roads we will never walk, built schools our children will never see, filled hospitals that will never treat our sick. That ends today. Every ounce melted here will remain here, turned into the schools, hospitals, and wells our people deserve. The crowd erupted outside their cheers, rolling in waves through the open doors. Inside the foundry, workers straightened with pride, their movements sharper, their focus absolute. This was no longer just metal. They were shaping the future of their country with their own hands. Traoré gestured toward the rows of cooling molds, each holding a bar stamped with the seal. These bars will not gather dust in a vault. They will gather bricks for classrooms, beds for hospitals, pumps for clean water. They will be transformed into something that lasts longer than gold: dignity, opportunity, life. Awa Diarra stood among the camera crews, her own lens trained on his face. She caught the glint in his eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw as he spoke. She knew this was more than a policy statement. It was a vow to those who took from us. Traoré continued, know this. You took gold. However, you couldn't take our will. You couldn't take away our solidarity. He bent down and picked up another bar, this one still warm and freshly stamped on the edges, and held it out to the audience, saying, this belongs to every child who marched for schools. And now, the very gold you thought would enrich you, will rebuild what you tried to break. To every child who put his life in danger for a just salary, to every mother who demanded safe water. I don't own this. This is yours. The reaction outside was immediate, a deafening roar chants of ours echoing through the streets. Even the soldiers at the gates smiled, their usual stoicism breaking under the force of the moment. Traoré placed the bar gently back on the table and stepped aside, so the cameras could capture the workers pouring the next crucible. The molten gold flowed like fire into the molds, each stream another line in the story they were writing together. Outside, a giant screen projected the live feed for the thousands gathered. Families pointed out the seal as each bar was lifted from its mold. Children waved the paper gold bars they had carried in their march, holding them up as if to greet their real counterparts. AY panned her camera from the workers to the faces in the crowd, knowing these images would travel far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Somewhere in the back an old miner wiped his eyes. I never thought I'd see this, he murmured. Our gold, our seal. As the broadcast drew to a close, Traoré stepped forward one last time. When the world sees this gold, they will know it was not sold, not stolen, but claimed, and they will know that a nation that keeps its gold keeps its future. The crowd answered with a single unified chant, the sound swelling like a heartbeat. Our gold, our future. In the foundry's heat, the gold kept flowing, each bar a promise stamped in metal, and beyond the gates, under the wide African sky, the people felt for the first time that the ground beneath their feet was truly their own. The first black SUV rolled up just after sunrise, its tinted windows hiding the faces inside. Within minutes, more followed, sleek diplomatic vehicles bearing U.S. embassy plates. They moved into position outside the military detention site, forming a tight semicircle that blocked the front entrance. Marines in crisp uniforms stood at attention beside them, hands resting near their sidearms. The hum of idling engines filled the air, low and steady like a warning. Inside the compound, the arrested American executives sat in their cells, already aware something was happening. Guards moved with sharpened purpose, rifles slung across their chests, eyes fixed on the gate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was in his office when the call came from the front post. "Sir, embassy convoy at the gate? They're asking for immediate access." He didn't ask for details. He already knew why they were here. He rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked out into the bright morning. The air was hot and dry, the sunlight glinting off the armored vehicles stationed along the perimeter. His soldiers formed up quickly, creating a line across the entrance. Beyond them, the lead SUV door opened, and a tall man in a navy suit stepped out. It was the deputy chief of mission from the U.S. Embassy, flanked by 2 aides. His tone was diplomatic, but his eyes carried the hard edge of someone used to getting what he came for. "Captain Traoré," he began, "I'm here on behalf of the United States government. We are formally requesting the immediate release of the American citizens you are holding." Traoré didn't move from where he stood. "They are not simply citizens," he replied evenly. "They are accused criminals in my country and they will be judged here." The diplomat offered a thin smile. "With respect, this is a serious matter. Their detention is causing an international incident. Washington is prepared to resolve this quickly if you are willing to cooperate." "Resolve?" Traoré repeated, tasting the word like it was bitter. "Is that what you call taking them away before they face the people whose lives they destroyed?" The man's smile didn't falter, but his voice tightened. "Captain, we can discuss restitution, compensation. There are channels for this. But this," he gestured toward the gates, "isn't how it's done." "This," Traoré said, his voice steady, but loud enough for the soldiers and the growing crowd beyond the barricades to hear, "is exactly how it's done when the law belongs to the people, not to foreign offices." A murmur rippled through the bystanders. Gathered down the street, some held up their phones recording. Others had come with signs left over from the Miners' March. No deals, no escape. The diplomat glanced toward the cameras uneasily. "If you refuse to cooperate, Captain, I am obligated to escalate this to my government. I can't guarantee the consequences will be pleasant." Traoré took a step forward, closing the space between them until they were face to face. His soldiers didn't move, but their grips tightened on their rifles. "You think I am afraid of consequences?" he asked quietly. "The only consequences I fear are failing my people." Behind him, the gates loomed tall and locked. Inside, the detainees were now pacing their expressions, a mix of hope and fear. They could hear the raised voices outside, but not the words. The diplomat tried once more. "If you keep them, you risk economic sanctions, aid cuts, isolation." "We have been isolated before," Traoré said sharply, "and we have survived. We will survive again. But what we will not do is hand over criminals so they can live comfortably while the children they harmed still drink from poisoned wells." The crowd erupted into cheers at his words. The embassy convoy's drivers exchanged uneasy looks. The diplomat's jaw tightened. "Then you are making a grave mistake." "No," Traoré said, turning away from him. "I am making a promise." He faced the crowd, now, raising his voice so all could hear. "These men will not be taken from this land until they have faced every witness, heard every testimony, and stood before the people they wronged. They will not leave in black cars to quiet rooms. They will leave only when justice is done." The soldiers at the gate shifted ready. The embassy vehicles didn't move, but the tension in the air was palpable, stretched tight like a wire. Cameras clicked. The moment was already spreading online. After a long pause, the diplomat gave a curt nod to his aides. "Very well, but this is not over." "No," Traoré said without looking back. "It isn't." The SUVs began to pull away one by one, the sound of their engines fading into the distance. The soldiers relaxed slightly, but the crowd's energy only grew, chanting Traoré's name, their voices carrying into the compound. Inside, the executives sat back down on the hard benches in their cells. Whatever hope they had felt at the sound of the engines was gone. The gates had not opened for them, and now they knew they never would, until the people themselves had spoken. The gold tunnel glowed under the harsh white lights, its walls gleaming like silent witnesses to everything that had happened within them. At the far end, a long wooden table had been set up, simple in design, but heavy with meaning. Behind it sat the Council of Elders, men and women chosen from villages across Burkina Faso, each carrying the weight of decades of service to their communities. They wore no robes, carried no gowns. Their authority came not from titles, but from the trust of the people. The accused knelt in the center of the tunnel, their wrists bound, their suits rumpled and stained from weeks in detention. They had listened to every testimony, every accusation. The cameras were rolling again, broadcasting live across the nation. No one wanted this decision delivered behind closed doors. The people would see it, hear it, and remember it. Traoré stood off to the side, his hands clasped behind his back, silent as the elders conferred in low tones. The murmur of the crowd outside the tunnel filtered in a steady hum, like distant thunder. When the head elder, a tall woman named Sira Bako, finally rose, the tunnel fell into absolute silence. Her eyes swept over the kneeling men before she spoke. "You came to our land as guests," she began, her voice carrying the authority of 1,000 gatherings under the shade of ancient trees. "You promised work roads and opportunity. Instead, you took our gold, poisoned our rivers, and left our people with nothing but graves and empty hands. You bribed those among us who were weak, and you believed we would remain silent." She let the words hang, the echo stretching into every crevice of the tunnel. "We have heard the mothers who buried their children. We have heard the miners who risked their lives for scraps while you dined in luxury. We have seen the villages that will never be whole again because of your greed." One of the executives opened his mouth as if to protest, but the sound of 100 people shifting closer silenced him. Sira's voice sharpened. "You will not leave this land. You will not return to your comfortable homes and forget what you have done. You will live out your days here in the prisons you deserve, working to repair what you have broken. You will breathe the same air as those you wronged, drink the same water, and know every day that you are here because the people willed it." Her gaze did not waver. "The verdict of this council by the voice of the people is life imprisonment in Burkina Faso." Outside the tunnel, the crowd erupted. "Justice! Justice!" The chant surged through the air like a wave, its rhythm pounding against the stone walls until it seemed the tunnel itself was joining in. The camera crews turned their lenses to the faces of the condemned. Some were pale and trembling, their eyes darting as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. Others tried to mask their fear with defiance, but their tightened jaws betrayed them. The camera lingered on each of them in turn, holding their expressions for the nation to see. In the front row of the crowd, just inside the tunnel, Miriam stood with her wooden staff, her eyes fixed on the men. She didn't smile, didn't cheer, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way her shoulders eased beside her. For Yakuba, the miner, who had held up his brother's dented helmet, nodded slowly. They had not come for vengeance. They had come for truth to be recognized, and now it had been. Awa Daira's camera captured a close-up of Sira Bako as she delivered her final words. "You thought gold was the most valuable thing in this land. You were wrong. The most valuable thing is justice, and today you have met it." Soldiers stepped forward to escort the prisoners out. The chains at their wrists clinked softly in the charged air. As they were led through the tunnel, the chants from outside grew louder, the sound wrapping around them like a verdict that would never fade. Traoré remained still until the last man had been taken out. Then he turned toward the elders, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture of respect. "You have spoken for the people," he said. Sira nodded. "And now, Captain, you must keep the promise you made to them that their gold will build the future." Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the gold-lit tunnel. The crowd pressed forward not to harm, but to see justice leave the tunnel in human form. The chant did not weaken. It grew stronger, a living drumbeat that followed the prisoners, all the way to the transport vehicles. In homes across the country, families watched the broadcast in silence, children leaning against their parents as the final shots of the condemned men filled the screen. When the image faded, the sound of the chants still seemed to hang in the air. Justice had been spoken in the gold tunnel, and it had answered. The council chamber was quiet, except for the soft shuffle of papers being placed before Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the gold seal of the Republic embossed on the top of the document. Around the long table sat ministers, community leaders, and representatives from the villages most scarred by the mining disaster. The air was heavy with anticipation. On the table before him lay the reparations decree, an unprecedented order that would take every coin seized from the illegal mining network and pour it directly into the veins of the country's wounded communities. It was more than a policy, it was a promise in ink. Traoré scanned the final page, his eyes tracing the lines one last time. "The profits taken from our land will now rebuild it," he said, his voice steady. "Not tomorrow, not in a year. Now." The decree spelled it out clearly. Funds from seized bank accounts, gold sales, and liquidated foreign assets would be allocated in 3 urgent phases. Rebuilding the towns that were damaged by toxic runoff was the first step. For those who had lost everything, permanent housing should come first. The second involves installing water filtration devices in each impacted neighborhood and cleaning and rehabilitating contaminated wells and waterways. In order to ensure that the next generation would inherit opportunity rather than destruction, the third built schools, clinics, and vocational institutions. He glanced up at everyone seated at the table. The first people to get new housing and medical attention will be the miners who survived the catastrophe. They've had enough waiting. Miriam sat with her hands folded over her wooden staff at the far end of the table. From her hamlet, she had been taken to see this. She said in a quiet but determined tone, "We've heard promises from captains before. On the wind, they were carried away." Traoré looked at her. "The ground will be engraved with this one. The houses will rise for you to see. The gold they stole will serve as the foundation for everything, and you will be able to drink clean water." Once more, with a familiar weight, he picked up the pen and boldly signed his name. The thud of his official stamp, forcing the seal into place, followed the sound of the pen on paper. There was a sigh in the room. zooming in on the ink, the seal, and the firm hand that had sworn allegiance to the state and its citizens. Awa Daira's camera captured the moment. She was aware that by nightfall, this picture would be featured on the first page, not only in Burkina Faso but also throughout the entire continent. The decree is legally binding, pushing the signed document in the direction of the clerks for prompt processing, Traoré declared. Today is the start of work. Teams were moving in a matter of hours. The most severely damaged towns were approached by military trucks laden with supplies. To designate the locations for future residences, surveyors spread out. For medical units and restoration plans, engineers started analyzing river water. They also set up mobile clinics for people who were still afflicted by years of contamination. The first convoy reached Mariam's village about noon. Alongside the trucks, kids ran, their laughter blending with the sound of engines. Bricks, shovels, and rolls of blueprints were brought down by the workers. One gestured toward the slope. He informed Mariam that the first houses would be here. They'll be higher than the floodline, real roofs and sturdy walls. Her eyes were full with tears, and she touched the edge of her headscarf. The signing was shown on screens at cafes, bus stops, and markets throughout the metropolis. Others paused to observe, some with cautious hope, and others with their arms crossed in skepticism. The atmosphere had changed by evening. The decree was hailed by radio broadcasters as a watershed, a sign that the gold tunnel case was about more than punishment, it was about healing. Teams at the Ministry of Health started compiling lists of survivors who would be given priority medical attention. Many have suffered from chronic pain, skin sores, respiratory issues, and mining pollutants for years without receiving treatment. In addition to justice, the decree offered them the opportunity to recover. Water trucks began to arrive in the disaster areas in the days that followed, providing potable water while permanent filtering systems were constructed. Families could draw water fearlessly for the first time in years. Children's joy reverberated across areas that had previously only experienced sorrow as they filled buckets and splashed each other. Traoré was given a cup from the new supply by a youngster in one village. It doesn't smell, he smiled. It has a rainy flavor. The captain nodded and took a sip. It should have always been that way. Images from AWAS reported showed schools emerging next to fields being cleared for planting, and brick walls growing where there had been rubble. An aged kid who had labored in the illicit tunnels under threat of assault was interviewed by her. He stood next to a house that was almost finished. He said, "I believed I would perish in the same ruin they left me in. I will now pass away. In my own home." Scenes like these minor, palpable alterations demonstrated that the gold was not disappearing into shadowy accounts or foreign hands in any area affected by the edict. It was there, substantial, growing, and obvious. Traoré returned to the council room and went over the initial progress reports. The indicators were obvious, even though the strategy had only been in place for a few days. This is just the beginning, he expressed to his ministers. As he talked, Mariam, who was in the capital to monitor the decree's progress, stood next to him. When the people see that justice builds, not just punishes, they will guard it with their lives. Despite her lack of a smile, she spoke with the assurance of someone who has finally witnessed words turn into deeds. "That's what we'll hold you to, Captain," she added. He gave a nod. "I anticipate that you will." The streets outside hummed with a unique vitality, the hum of a country witnessing its stolen wealth return home in the form of clean water, bricks, and mortar, not the rage of protest or the tension of confrontation. Justice was more than just a word. For the first time in years, you could actually touch it. It started in Bamako, where a group of people gathered outside the parliament building and held up posters that read, "Our land, our wealth." At first, there were only a few hundred people there, but within hours, the number of people had grown. 2,000. They chanted against their own leaders, not a foreign power, and demanded that they emulate Burkina Faso. "Why can't you restore the gold to your people the way Traoré can?" Over the sea of bodies, a young woman's voice could be heard as she spoke into a megaphone. Across the continent, news images from Bamako sparked a movement. Miners in Freetown chanted for control of their diamond fields as they marched through the streets carrying boulders and ore from their own land. Students in Kinshasa blocked the major boulevard with their marches and painted banners demanding an end to contracts negotiated behind closed doors. Fishermen in Accra gathered at the harbor to protest that, like their treasure, their oceans were being sold. The message was the same from Dar es Salaam. Africa must be the first to benefit from its resources. The demonstration started in Nairobi when college students poured out of lecture halls. They carried pictures of the restitution decree being signed, the elders rendering judgment, and the gold tunnel verdict. Traoré standing in front of the CEOs who were kneeling. The images had gone viral, representing the silent resentment of a continent. One student leader informed the audience that justice is not charity. Regaining what is rightfully ours and utilizing it to shape our future is justice. Comparisons of side-by-side flooded social media. African riches was based on dilapidated schools in the towns that produced it, and gleaming towers in foreign capitals. Swahili hashtags. The pulse of the movement traveled from city to city in English, French, and Arabic. Governments were unable to overlook it after miners in Lusaka stopped access to a significant copper plant and demanded that all export contracts be made public. The president called an urgent meeting of his ministers. An unexpected resolution to audit all international mining agreements inked in the last 20 years was presented to Parliament in Harare. In official circles, the concern was evident. The cozy arrangements that had maintained wealth moving outward for decades would be overturned if Burkina Faso's model gained traction. Stability, their hidden euphemism for maintaining the status quo, was demanded by foreign investors, but things were changing. When African Union representatives approached the summit hall in Addis Ababa, they were encircled by protesters. Numerous demonstrators were carrying tiny hand-painted copies of the national seal of Burkina Faso, which was stamped into gold bars. "One Africa, one riches" was the chant that reverberated off the marble walls. It was difficult to ignore the pressure. Inside the peak, delegates muttered that if their personal resource agreements were questioned, they might be branded the next target. Sensing a shift in the tide, a few leaders publicly endorsed the movement. Our people will no longer tolerate seeing their wealth leave in ships they never see again, a president from West Africa stated. Tens of thousands of people attended a rally outside the stock market in Johannesburg, where young activists brandishing Pan-African flags stood next to former mine workers in worn uniforms. "We must reclaim control, or they will reclaim it for us." The audience screamed in agreement when a speaker on the main stage held up a picture of the gold tunnel and said, "This is not just Burkina Faso's fight. This is the fight of every African nation betrayed by its own wealth." Overnight, murals started to sprout on Lagos Street. In one, Traoré was seen giving a child wearing a school uniform a gold bar that was stamped with the national seal. In another, Africa was portrayed as a huge tree with roots that drew oil barrels and bars of diamonds and gold back into the ground. It was dubbed Replanting the Future by artists. There was opposition to the movement. State media attempted to portray the disturbance as having foreign influences, and riot police were used to break up protests in a number of key cities. The protesters, however, did not miss the irony. The very thing they were battling was foreign control over their resources. During a national broadcast in Ouagadougou, Traoré spoke about the expanding continental wave. He addressed the camera squarely as he stood in the gold tunnel once more. "This goes beyond Burkina Faso. We are all aware of the fact that the land beneath our feet belongs to us by right rather than by agreement, and no one can accuse us of stealing when we decide to keep what is rightfully ours." All around Africa, his remarks were repeated in bus stops and marketplaces. A banana vendor in Katana paused to view a video on a bystander's phone. "Quietly," she said, "he's speaking for all of us. If they can do it there, why not here?" A cab driver asked his passengers in Katana. The wave of resource nationalism was more than just a theory. There were voices, faces, and momentum to the movement. It was evident in the speeches, the art, the chanting that persisted, and the streets. One name was mentioned everywhere. It showed up not as a savior, but as evidence. Traoré was a ceremonial quiet in the air in Ouagadougou on the day the gold tunnel was sealed. People started coming in from all around the nation in the early morning. In fading overalls, miners, elders draped in traditional fabric, mothers carrying pictures of their children, pupils holding tiny notebooks to capture the moment. They came to see the beginning of what a place might become, not its demise. Soldiers stood at attention at the gate, but they were there as stewards of something sacred, not as protectors against intruders. Once a representation of theft and concealment, the shining archway was now covered with the flag of the country. Before entering, guests might sign their names in a book on a large white table in front of it, perhaps promising to remember what had happened there, that the change within was glaring. A gentle golden glow had taken the place of the harsh industrial lights, giving the tunnel walls a sense of warmth. The formerly vacant area now had rows of bronze plaques set into the stone, each bearing the name of a community that had been damaged by the illicit mining. Below those names, a list of the lives lost was shown one by one. Only a few names were listed on some plaques. Others were packed from one end to the other. The impact was tremendous. The gold in the walls still gleamed, but no longer as a lure for greed, and the air became quieter as guests ventured more into the tunnel. The shuffle of footsteps resonating like whispers. As a witness, it glowed instead, preserving the memory of what had been taken and what had been recovered. The focal point of the memorial was a circular area that had been cut out close to the middle of the tunnel. On a black stone pedestal, a solitary block of unpolished, untouched gold stood in the center of it. Words in 3 languages were engraved around its base for the benefit of the populace, for the future, for the land. That morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood with his beret tucked under his arm. He avoided addressing the cameras. Rather, he moved carefully around the plaques, stopping occasionally to use his fingertips to trace the letters of a name. He paused as he came to the plaque commemorating Mariam's village. She was leaning on her wooden stick at his side. She whispered, "They'll be coming here for years. The offspring of our grandchildren will arrive. When they see our names, they will be aware of the price." He gave a nod. "They will also be aware that we didn't remain silent." With her camera, Awa Diarra meticulously navigated through the crowd, capturing the faces of those who were sorrowful, tear-streaked, and filled with a silent sense of pride. She saw a picture of a small boy in a school uniform, looking up at a plaque while his father mumbled the meaning behind the names. The boy's palm was pushed against the cold bronze. A school choir outside sung a specially composed hymn, their voices echoing into the tunnel like a pledge. The ceiling itself was straightforward but effective. Engineers positioned a huge steel gate painted the deep red of Burkina dirt at the far end of the tunnel. Large and uncompromising, the national seal was engraved over its surface. The Council of Elders was given a ceremonial key once the last bolts were fastened, as a symbolic reminder that the gold tunnel now belonged to the people in more than just name. They, not the state, would keep it. Over the next few months, the memorial became a destination for pilgrims. Every day, buses arrive with whole families, church groups, market vendors, and students. They came to stand in front of the block of gold and think, to walk the entire length of the tunnel, and to read the plaques out loud. Some left a folded piece of paper with a prayer inscribed on it, a miner's lantern, a child's art, flowers, and little trinkets. You will live out your days here in the prisons you deserve, working to repair what you have broken. You will breathe the same air as those you wronged, drink the same water, and know every day that you are here because the people willed it. Her gaze did not waver. The verdict of this council by the voice of the people is life imprisonment in Burkina Faso. Outside the tunnel, the crowd erupted. Justice, justice. The chant surged through the air like a wave, its rhythm pounding against the stone walls until it seemed the tunnel itself was joining in. The camera crews turned their lenses to the faces of the condemned. Some were pale and trembling, their eyes darting as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. Others tried to mask their fear with defiance, but their tightened jaws betrayed them. The camera lingered on each of them in turn, holding their expressions for the nation to see. In the front row of the crowd, just inside the tunnel, Miriam stood with her wooden staff, her eyes fixed on the men. She didn't smile, didn't cheer, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way her shoulders eased beside her. For Yakuba, the miner who had held up his brother's dented helmet, nodded slowly. They had not come for vengeance. They had come for truth to be recognized. And now it had been Awa Diarra. Camera captured a close-up of Sarah Bako as she delivered her final words. You thought gold was the most valuable thing in this land? You were wrong. The most valuable thing is justice, and today you have met it. Soldiers stepped forward to escort the prisoners out. The chains at their wrists clinked softly in the charged air. As they were led through the tunnel, the chants from outside grew louder, the sound wrapping around them like a verdict that would never fade. Traoré remained still until the last man had been taken out. Then he turned toward the elders, placing his hand over his heart in a gesture of respect. You have spoken for the people, he said. Sira nodded. And now, Captain, you must keep the promise you made to them, that their gold will build the future. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. After the gold-lit tunnel, the crowd pressed forward not to harm, but to see justice leave the tunnel in human form. The chant did not weaken. It grew stronger, a living drumbeat that followed the prisoners, all the way to the transport vehicles. In homes across the country, families watched the broadcast in silence, children leaning against their parents as the final shots of the condemned men filled the screen. When the image faded, the sound of the chants still seemed to hang in the air. Justice had been spoken in the gold tunnel, and it had answered. The council chamber was quiet, except for the soft shuffle of papers being placed before Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the gold seal of the Republic embossed on the top of the document. Around the long table sat ministers, community leaders, and representatives from the villages most scarred by the mining disaster. The air was heavy with anticipation. On the table before him lay the reparations decree, an unprecedented order that would take every coin seized from the illegal mining network and pour it directly into the veins of the country's wounded communities. It was more than a policy. It was a promise in ink. Traoré scanned the final page, his eyes tracing the lines one last time. The profits taken from our land will now rebuild it, he said, his voice steady. Not tomorrow, not in a year. Now, the decree spelled it out clearly. Funds from seized bank accounts, gold sales, and liquidated foreign assets would be allocated in 3 urgent phases. Rebuilding the towns that were damaged by toxic runoff was the first step. For those who had lost everything, permanent housing should come first. The second involves installing water filtration devices in each impacted neighborhood and cleaning and rehabilitating contaminated wells and waterways. In order to ensure that the next generation would inherit opportunity rather than destruction, the third built schools, clinics, and vocational institutions. He glanced up at everyone seated at the table. The first people to get new housing and medical attention will be the miners who survived the catastrophe. They've had enough waiting. Miriam sat with her hands folded over her wooden staff at the far end of the table. From her hamlet, she had been taken to see this, she said in a quiet but determined tone. We've heard promises from captains before, on the wind. They were carried away. Traoré looked at her. The ground will be engraved with this one. The houses will rise for you to see. The gold they stole will serve as the foundation for everything, and you will be able to drink clean water. Once more, with a familiar weight, he picked up the pen and boldly signed his name. The thud of his official stamp forcing the seal into place followed the sound of the pen on paper. There was a sigh in the room. Zooming in on the ink, the seal, and the firm hand that had sworn allegiance to the state and its citizens, Owadiras. Camera captured the moment. She was aware that by nightfall, this picture would be featured on the first page, not only in Burkina Faso, but also throughout the entire continent. The decree is legally binding. Pushing the signed document in the direction of the clerks for prompt processing, Traoré declared, "Today is the start of work." Teams were moving in a matter of hours. The most severely damaged towns were approached by military trucks laden with supplies. To designate the locations for future residences, surveyors spread out for medical units and restoration plans. Engineers started analyzing river water. They also set up mobile clinics for people who were still afflicted by years of contamination. The first convoy reached Mariam's village about noon. Alongside the trucks, kids ran, their laughter blending with the sound of engines. Bricks, shovels, and rolls of blueprints were brought down by the workers. One gestured toward the slope. He informed Mariam that the first houses would be here. They'll be higher than the floodline, real roofs and sturdy walls. Her eyes were full with tears, and she touched the edge of her headscarf. The signing was shown on screens at cafes, bus stops, and markets throughout the metropolis. Others paused to observe, some with cautious hope and others with their arms crossed in skepticism. The atmosphere had changed by evening. The decree was hailed by radio broadcasters as a watershed, a sign that the gold tunnel case was about more than punishment. It was about healing. Teams at the Ministry of Health started compiling lists of survivors who would be given priority medical attention. Many have suffered from chronic pain, skin sores, respiratory issues, and mining pollutants for years without receiving treatment. In addition to justice, the decree offered them the opportunity to recover. Water trucks began to arrive in the disaster areas in the days that followed, providing potable water while permanent filtering systems were constructed. Families could draw water fearlessly for the first time in years. Children's joy reverberated across areas that had previously only experienced sorrow as they filled buckets and splashed each other. Traoré was given a cup from the new supply by a youngster in one village. "It doesn't smell," he smiled. "It has a rainy flavor." The captain nodded and took a sip. "It should have always been that way." Images from Airways reported showed schools emerging next to fields being cleared for planting, and brick walls growing where there had been rubble. An aged kid who had labored in the illicit tunnels under threat of assault was interviewed by her. He stood next to a house that was almost finished. He said, "I believed I would perish in the same ruin they left me in. I will now pass away. In my own home." Scenes like these minor, palpable alterations demonstrated that the gold was not disappearing into shadowy accounts or foreign hands in any area affected by the edict. It was there, substantial, growing, and obvious. Traoré returned to the council room and went over the initial progress reports. The indicators were obvious even though the strategy had only been in place for a few days. "This is just the beginning," he expressed to his ministers. As he talked, Mariam, who was in the capital to monitor the decree's progress, stood next to him. "When the people see that justice builds, not just punishes, they will guard it with their lives." Despite her lack of a smile, she spoke with the assurance of someone who has finally witnessed words turn into deeds. "That's what we'll hold you to, Captain," she added. He gave a nod. "I anticipate that you will." The streets outside hummed with a unique vitality. The hum of a country witnessing its stolen wealth return home in the form of clean water, bricks and mortar, not the rage of protest or the tension of confrontation. Justice was more than just a word for the first time in years. You could actually touch it. Burkina were not the only ones to arrive. As a show of solidarity, visitors from all around Africa arrived, some carrying soil from their own mining villages, which they then carefully poured at the tunnel's entrance. International leaders strolled down its length in silence, exiting with thoughtful expressions. Journalists referred to it as the world's most peculiar monument, a site that recognized the cost of justice rather than exalting victory. The sound was the most poignant element for many. There was never complete silence in the tunnel. The subtle sound of footfall and the rustle of visitors' movements created an impression of a live presence. Even on the quietest days, as though the walls themselves were remembering. Mariam came back one afternoon with a group of kids from her community. They pointed out well-known names as they moved their hands over the plaques. Knowing that memory deteriorates unless it is given a home, she kept a tight eye on them. In that instant, under the gentle light and the constant brilliance of the walls, the gold no longer felt like metal as she said to them, "When people speak of the gold tunnel, they will not speak of greed. They will speak of you, of your families, of what we won back." It sounded like a voice defending what was defended rather than what was taken. The cool air in the gold tunnel still carried the subtle smell of stone and polished metal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré moved at a leisurely pace, his boots tapping the ground steadily. With their names engraved on them, the bronze plaques on either side glinted in the gentle golden light. serving as a reminder of the location's purpose. As he passed the warm metal from the light, he allowed his fingertips to touch one plaque. The sound of soft footfall dwindled behind him, as though to signal the conclusion of a voyage that had started in the dark. He was exiting the tunnel by himself. The sun streamed like a river of fire through the wide gateway ahead. His form was outlined by the glow as he moved closer, and the gold behind him appeared to blend with the light in front of him. He passed through the barrier and came out into a sky so dazzling that it seemed like everyone in the nation was awake and watching. The sound of children laughing was carried by a breeze that lifted the edge of his jacket. Boys and girls in school uniforms were running toward him, their faces beaming with happiness, either barefoot or wearing old sandals. Others carried tiny paper gold bars from the marches that had rocked the country months earlier, while others brought flowers. They came to him one by one, thrusting their presents into his hands and putting their arms around his waist for a moment, before scurrying away. Standing on tiptoe, a young girl wearing a blue dress gave him a single red bloom. "Shilly," she said, "for the schools." Grinning, he slipped it into his pocket. The silence around them was due to awe rather than restraint. In the blaze of conflict, they had witnessed him at podiums in combat gear. They now noticed him carrying flowers from children's hands here, unsecured in the light. It was recorded in a single sweeping shot by Awa Diarist camera. He was surrounded by children, the horizon was open and wide, and the tunnel behind him was sealed and shining in the sunlight. The children followed him as he started toward the square, their laughing blending with the sound of the flowers rustling. The pressure of politics, the roar of spectators, and the weight of riches all seemed distant in that instant. All that was left was something deeper, calmer, and more unbreakable. The final words? They thought gold was the prize. The voiceover, which was recorded later but was inspired by this very moment, would say, the real treasure was dignity returned. And everyone who walked next to him saw the truth etched in their faces as Traoré strode into the light, the flowers in his hands, swinging with every step.